You've probably felt it, that eerie sense that you're seeing something no one else is. Not because you're paranoid, but because you're perceptive. You enter a room and before a word is spoken, you feel it, the tension, the energy, the unspoken stories stitched into the silence. Most people miss it, but not you. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he also warned, it comes at a cost. Because when you see deeply into people, into systems, into yourself, you don't just notice beauty. You see cracks, contradictions, masks, shadows. And if you name them, if you dare to speak what others pretend not to notice, you become a threat. This is the hidden price of awareness. You think you're just observing reality, but to those around you, you're disrupting it. Because most people aren't trying to wake up. They're trying to stay comfortable. So when you reflect something true, something wrong, they flinch, or worse, they attack. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right. And your clarity unsettles the illusions they depend on. It's not your intelligence they resent, it's your refusal to play along. You don't celebrate small talk. You don't fake enthusiasm. You don't echo the group just to belong. And that's what makes you dangerous. Not loud, not rebellious, but real. In a world built on performance, authenticity is subversive. That's why people who see too clearly often feel exiled, not physically, but emotionally. You're surrounded, but not connected. Included, but not understood. And that loneliness, it's not just social, it's existential. Jung called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming your true self. But what he didn't sugarcoat is this: individuation separates you from your former self, from your old beliefs, sometimes from the people you love. Because to evolve is to shed illusions, and illusions are often the glue holding relationships together. When you outgrow a dynamic, when you stop playing your assigned role, the system reacts. Friends grow distant, family grows uncomfortable. You're told you've changed, and you have, but they don't see that as growth. They see it as betrayal. Why? Because your transformation exposes their stagnation. And instead of facing it, they project it onto you. They say you're selfish, cold, cynical, too much, not enough, anything to avoid seeing themselves. So you question it. Maybe you are too intense, too analytical, too suspicious. Maybe if you just smiled more, nodded more, filtered less. But the truth is, your perception isn't the problem. It's your willingness to follow it. Jung knew this path well. He called it the descent into the unconscious, where you confront not just what society hides, but what you hide from yourself, your fears, your rage, your longing. And once you go there, once you truly see, you can't unsee. You notice manipulation, even when it's dressed as love. You notice compliance, even when it's cloaked in politeness. You notice despair, even behind the brightest smiles. And while others say, stop overthinking, you're not overthinking. You're seeing, feeling, sensing what's beneath the surface. That's why conversations drain you, crowds overwhelm you. Noise isn't just loud, it's intrusive, because you're processing layers most people ignore. But here's the paradox. The very sensitivity that isolates you is also your superpower. You don't just read the room, you read the silence between words. You don't just remember facts, you remember patterns. You don't just feel emotions, you track their origins. And that makes you hard to deceive, hard to manipulate, hard to control, which is why many try to dim your insight, not through argument, but through shame. They say you're too intense, too negative, too serious. They want you to shrink, to doubt yourself, to censor your truth, not because it's wrong, but because it's disruptive. They want your mind muted. But Jung would tell you, never trade your clarity for connection. Because the people who truly see you, they're not threatened by your insight. They're drawn to it. They recognize it because they've walked the same path, faced the same exile, chosen the same truth. So don't dilute yourself for comfort. Don't abandon your perception to protect someone else's denial. Your mind isn't a curse, it's a mirror. And sometimes people don't hate what they see in you, they hate what you reflect back to them. But mirrors don't apologize for reflecting reality. Neither should you. The discomfort you evoke in others isn't always a sign to soften. Sometimes it's a sign you're revealing what they've spent years avoiding. And avoidance, Jung would say, is one of the most dangerous patterns of all. Because what's left in the dark doesn't disappear, it festers. And when a person refuses to face their own unconscious, they outsource it, they project, they scapegoat, they attack. Not the real you, but the parts of themselves they refuse to acknowledge. Your presence becomes a trigger, not because you've harmed them, but because you remind them of everything unresolved. And when that happens, the temptation is to hide again, to shrink, to contort yourself into something more palatable, more agreeable, more forgettable. But that's not awakening. That's regression. To carry clarity in a world addicted to delusion is to become a threat to the collective trance. You don't even need to speak. Sometimes just existing as an awake person in an unconscious room is enough to provoke resistance. They sense it, the awareness, the refusal, the quiet rebellion of your gaze. And Jung would say, good, that means you're alive. But don't mistake clarity for cruelty. Seeing through illusion doesn't require arrogance. It requires responsibility, the ability to hold what you see without letting it make you bitter. Because the deeper you go into the psyche, yours and others, the easier it is to lose compassion, to grow cold, to label rather than understand. But that's just another defense, another way to feel superior instead of vulnerable. Real perception doesn't inflate you, it humbles you. Because once you truly see others, you see yourself in their defenses, in their projections, in their wounds. You realize you're not above the patterns. You're made of them too. The only difference is you're willing to face them. And that willingness, that's where power begins. Not control over others, but sovereignty over self. Because the more conscious you become, the harder it is to be manipulated. Guilt stops working, praise stops seducing, chaos stops controlling. You stop reacting and start responding. And that's terrifying to people who rely on your emotional reactivity to feel powerful. When you no longer take the bait, the game falls apart. And that's when your insight becomes liberation. Not just for you, but for anyone watching. Because perception is contagious. When you model clarity, others start questioning. When you model boundaries, others start resisting. When you speak the truth, calmly, clearly, unapologetically, you give others permission to do the same. And that's why people who see clearly aren't just misfits, they're catalysts. Jung believed that a single individual who awakens to their own unconscious can transform an entire system. Not by force, but by presence, by example. But the price of that role is solitude. Not always, but often. Because the further you go on the path of individuation, the fewer people you meet along the way. Many stay behind, clinging to roles, stories, masks. And you keep walking. Not because you want to be alone, but because you refuse to abandon what's real. And sometimes that's what it takes. You give up the comfort of being liked for the integrity of being whole. You stop seeking permission and start trusting your perception. You stop waiting to be understood and start understanding yourself. And slowly the fear of being different dissolves because you realize being different wasn't the problem. Pretending not to be was. You were never too sensitive, too observant, too intense. You were tuned in. And while that tuning cost you proximity, it gave you something far more valuable, alignment. Alignment with truth, with depth, with your own soul. And from that alignment, you don't just see the world more clearly, you begin to shape it. Not through domination, but through discernment. You choose your battles, your circles, your silence. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop absorbing chaos just to feel connected. You stop shrinking your light to protect fragile egos. And in that restraint, in that refusal, your power becomes quiet, but undeniable. You're no longer loud, but you're felt. Not because you demand attention, but because your presence disrupts illusions. You don't need to be the smartest, or the strongest, or the most eloquent. You just need to be real. In a world obsessed with the superficial, depth is its own rebellion. And the deeper you go, the more invisible you may feel. But invisibility is not erasure. Sometimes it's protection, sometimes it's preparation. Because the world isn't kind to seers, to feelers, to those who notice what others dismiss. But the world needs them. It needs you. Not to fix it, not to save it, but to witness it honestly, to name what's unspoken, to carry what others drop, to stay awake, even when it would be easier to dream. So don't betray your vision. Don't soften your gaze just to fit into a reality you've already outgrown. Let others call it overthinking. You'll know it as seeing. Let others call it intensity. You'll know it as truth. And when it gets heavy, when the weight of perception feels unbearable, remember you're not alone. There are others. Quiet, watching, waiting, walking the same lonely road toward the same relentless clarity. And when your paths cross, you'll know. No small talk, no pretense, just the mutual recognition of what it means to see and to keep seeing anyway. Because once you've tasted truth, illusion is never satisfying again.